Thank you very much. And I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which you're gathering, and also the people of the land that I'm coming to you from today. Any First Nations people in the room there, and those of you who have journeyed from First Nations country to be there today, my respect to all of you. Yes, I would have loved to have been there. I'd love to have been there in person, but it's been a tough couple of weeks. Not only taking care of my own safety and my family's safety, given the level of threat that's been made against us, and there are legal cases pending with that. We have been advised just to keep our travel to a minimum at the moment, and so I'm doing that, and also, of course, just trying to stay close to my family and look after my mental health and make sure that my family are being well cared for, and that my children are well cared for and safe as well. So yeah, I'm sorry that I can't actually be there with you, but I wanted to talk to you anyway, particularly at this time. It isn't what I wanted to talk to you about. I was planning to come there and talk to you about reporting the news about my own career, particularly reporting First Nations issues this year around The Voice. But that, of course, has been overtaken by events of the past couple of weeks, which have been bewildering in many respects for me, not unexpected, but still the ferocity of it, the intensity of it has certainly unnerved me and taken my breath away, to be honest. I was describing it to someone just the other day that it was like there is an electrical storm and you can't get out of the storm, and then you realise that you are the storm itself. So it's been a very tough time, but it does prompt, I think, an important conversation that we need to have, and that is about the role of the media and the news media. So much has been made of the racist abuse that me and my family have suffered over the past couple of weeks. In many respects, that's not new. And First Nations people in the room, people of colour in the room, would know all too well that we deal with those things every single day. From a look in a shop, from how someone speaks to you, to opportunities that may be denied to us, to the joke that we're all supposed to laugh at, to the assumptions that are made against us, to the outright racial abuse that we may encounter at any time, to the trauma that we've inherited from our history, to the lived experiences of our families. If you're in the public eye, as I am, that is something that is unrelenting. It simply never stops. The past 2 weeks, it's been dialed up to 100, but it is always there. There is always a low hum of racism that I have to deal with and shield myself against, and my family has to deal with every single day. But it has been intensified in the past few weeks. There's been a lot of discussion about social media and the nature of social media, the toxicity of social media. And again, that is true. It is the carrier of so much hate. It amplifies hatred and violence. It offers cowards anonymity from which they can attack us. It doesn't have accountability. It doesn't have ethics or morality. But we've been wading through the sludge of social media for a long time now. Sadly, again, like racism, it is something that we have had to navigate and grow far too used to. I think what is more important here, and something that I have tried to focus attention on, is the role of what we call mainstream media itself. I have not stepped away from hosting Q&A and taken a break from the media, as I've said repeatedly, just because of racism, or even because of social media. I'm not even on social media platforms, and still I learn about it. I learn about it from people who stop me in the street, or when I go to get a coffee and someone tells me about something they've read. It's in the air that I breathe. It poisons the air that I breathe. But I can avoid that, largely. But one of the reasons, and the primary reason I think that I've taken a break right now, is I have to ask myself about the complicity and the toxicity of mainstream media and how I am implicated in that. Try as I might, or whatever ethical values I may hold, I am part of mainstream media that in so many ways is poisoning the bloodstream of our society. It is often through mainstream media that we fan the hatred and the vitriol that we see dialed up on social media. It is the way that we engage in debate. It is the way that we reduce public discourse, as I have written, to an amusement park, where we take people's lives and trash them, where we don't have discussion or informed debate as much as we have an argument and the shrill voices are heard. That is what I've had to ask myself. To what extent am I also complicit and implicated in a media that is doing damage to our society? And when do we say stop? And if we can't have the hard conversations that we need to have in this country about the most fragile and sensitive issues, none more so than the treatment of my people, First Nations people. If we can't have those conversations without descending into hatred and bitterness, putting up walls between us, lying, fanning the flames of division and hatred, if we can't do that, then we're better to walk away. Now, someone once said to me recently that the episode that I did of Q&A on this particular week, they said, that was a good episode of Q&A last night. And I said, was it? I don't think it was as good as a good walk. And I don't know that I have done television, an hour of news television, for a long time that I think would be the equal of a good walk, of sitting with a book, of talking to your loved ones, of listening to music. I think there are so many other things that we can do with our time that is going to be conducive to a better and healthier society, both for us as individuals and collectively. I don't think that there is anything in the media at the moment that is contributing to that better society. We are better off to turn it off. Over the past couple of weeks, I have read nothing about what has been written about me. I've watched no television news and I've turned off the radio. And I am better for it. I am better for it. There are so many things in our national debate that we simply do not need to be engaged in. We do not need to be constantly connected to media. We need to time out to think about things that are important, to anchor ourselves in our values, in our cultures. Yes, it is important to be informed. It's important to be able to make good judgments in a democracy for the betterment of our society. It is important to know what is going on. But so much of what passes for news discussion or coverage is not about being informed. It is simply about the noise. And I wanted to reflect on how I have seen that emerge throughout my career and look at the way that has played into what's happened to me over the past couple of weeks and what it means particularly for First Nations journalists trying to just do our jobs in what is so far too often a hostile environment. I came into journalism 40 years ago this year. 40 years ago this year. 24/7 news had not been invented. There was no CNN. We didn't have the constant drip of news that we have today. We still wrote many of our stories by hand, and we still had to file our reports down a telephone line. If I wanted to send vision back from when I was out in the field reporting, we had to go to a feed station, book a satellite, and send it back. It slowed the process down. We valued things like accuracy. We valued taking our time with a story. I remember being told when I came into journalism, one of the first things I was told, it is important to be first. It is more important first to be right. And I've seen so much of that change over my time because of technology, but also because of attitudes. As a First Nation person coming into the media, 40 years ago, there was almost no one. There had been a handful of First Nations people who had worked in various media platforms, but there was no real representation. There was no force of numbers. When I walked into the newsroom, I was the only one. It meant that there was no one who looked like me, no one who shared my history, no one who laughed at the things that I laughed at, no one that I could just go off and have a cup of coffee with or have lunch with and not even have to speak, to know that they understood who I was because we were the same people. And it was racially hostile. Racial jokes were told constantly. People put on stupid, mocking accents of Aboriginal people. They would often dismiss Aboriginal stories. Blacks don't rate, they would tell me time and time again. If I ever did anything that they considered praiseworthy, then the highest form of praise was to say to me, good on you, Stan. You're almost a white man. You're almost a white man. How did I survive in that environment? In that hostile, brutal environment where there was simply no one else like me? I had to make a decision very early on that if I was going to survive and endure, if I was going to be able to pursue a career, I had to fight the long fight. That I could not simply battle every single racial comment that was made. I had to win the big battles. I got into work earlier than everybody else. I stayed later than everybody else. I read more. I was smarter than everybody else. It was a battle, a long battle that I decided I would win. And I did. I've travelled around the world. In a 40-year career, I've worked out of more than 80 countries. I've covered the biggest stories of our time, from the release of Nelson Mandela and the end of apartheid, to the troubles in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, the death of Princess Diana, the handover of Hong Kong, the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. I've been based in Jerusalem. I've been based in New York. I've been based in London, Hong Kong and Beijing. I've travelled into the secretive world of North Korea. I've had a front row seat at history. I've seen history turn. I've had the opportunity of working for the biggest news networks in the world, including CNN, the American news giant. I've had a career that would have been improbable and unimaginable from how I grew up as a poor Aboriginal kid in New South Wales with a black family, an itinerant family moving from town to town. A lot of things had to go right for me to have that career. But I also had to bring something to myself, and First Nations people in the room are going to know this, that I had to be not twice as good, but 10 times as good. That I had to knock down those walls, suffer the indignities, the hostilities, the jokes, to be able to forge a career for myself. To become the first First Nations person to host a prime time commercial current affairs program. to still to this day being the only First Nations person presenting a prime time current affairs program on ABC television, to still work in an industry that is overwhelmingly white, not just a failure of First Nations representation, but a failure to look like Australia in 2023. And here I find myself wondering, what was all that for? Because 40 years later, after walking into newsrooms where people mocked my people, laughed at my people, and said if I did anything well, I was almost a white man, to taking a break from an industry that frankly I may never go back to, with the shouts and abuse of racists in my ears, with people threatening to kill me and my family, and an organisation at the ABC that spectacularly failed to support me or speak up for me as I faced this barrage day after day. And not just to not speak up for me, but to fail to speak to the truth. And so it leads me to ask these questions about where we are today as a media. From when I first walked into the newsroom, the media landscape has entirely changed. 24/7 news has been a revolution. And yet in so many ways, it has amplified hatred and damaged our society. 24/7 news was meant to liberate us. It was meant to democratise us. Social media was meant to give voice to the voiceless. Suddenly, media was not controlled by the big conglomerates, the big companies, but it was in the hands of ordinary people. And yes, that has made a difference. I've covered revolutions in the world, particularly revolutions in the Middle East, led by social media. But I've also seen how it can be turned against us. 24/7 news took us front and centre to wars as they were happening. We got closer to conflict than we had ever been before. And yet I also have to reflect and say that 24/7 news has probably contributed to conflict today. We have sped up the transmission of news. It is harder to be heard. To be heard, we must shout louder and louder and louder. The next person must shout over the other person. And when we shout, we stop thinking, we stop discussing, and we start pointing the finger and we start blaming. We have not built a stronger democracy. Democracy has eroded over the past 30 years as 24/7 news and social media has exploded. Freedom House, which measures the health of democracy around the world, now counts 15 straight years of declining democracy. There are fewer democratic states today than there were last year, the year before, or the year before that. In the United States, supposedly the home of modern democracy, we saw the Capitol building, the symbol of democracy in the United States, ransacked by Trump's supporters, tearing it apart because they would not accept the result of an election. We saw the election of Donald Trump, driven by division and hatred. As he said, American carnage, not the American dream. We've seen barbed wire going back up on the borders of Europe and the rise of neo-Nazi far-right political parties. We've seen massacres of people driven by political hate. We've seen a rise of terrorism around our world. We've seen an acceleration of all of these things as 24/7 news has shrunk our world and sped up events. We don't get time to consider or to ponder. Politicians are expected to have answers now, right now, and to come back an hour later and to have another answer. We don't get time to consider policy. We are meant to deliver policy right now. And if we don't, we are accused of not responding quickly enough. There are endless opinion polls which tell us and tell politicians what they should be doing rather than politicians and us deciding on the best course of action, the most considered course of action. And someone who has sat at the heart of this I've wondered about my own role in this, because there have been so many times hosting programs like Q&A, when in the interests of, in inverted commas, balance, we don't get two people with differences of opinion. We end up getting two people who dislike or even hate each other, who would rather yell and point at each other than try to find the common ground, to try to find that common ground and then discuss their differences. We would rather put people diametrically opposed and point and shout at each other. And every time we do that, you can hear social media firing up, and more hatred, more vitriol, more damaged lives, more broken lives, more mental illness, more suicide, because we are feeding this into the bloodstream of our societies. What hope do my people have in this environment? What hope do people who are the most impoverished and imprisoned people in the country, who die 10 years younger than the rest of the population, people for whom there is little political representation, people for whom there is no treaty, no sovereignty, no self-determination? What hope do my people have of being heard in a world where truth is no longer even true? We don't even know what truth is, and to speak truth risks being rained down with hatred and venom. What hope do our people have? Well, I learned that, didn't I, 2 weeks ago with the coronation of King Charles. Last year, when Queen Elizabeth died, we were told at the time that this was not the time to discuss colonisation and empire. This was not the time to discuss the worst of our history. This was a time to mourn Queen Elizabeth and pay respect to her life. But where was the respect for my people's lives? At the time, we were told it wasn't appropriate. I've written a book, The Queen is Dead, that emerges out of that time when we were told that our stories were to be silenced again in our country because of deference to the Crown. This time at the ABC, they said they would do it differently. With the coronation of King Charles, we would have that conversation. And so we did. Out of a 6 or 7 hour broadcast, we devoted 45 minutes. Before the coronation had even begun, before the ceremony had even begun, we devoted 45 minutes to a conversation, talking about these issues of our history. I knew what was going to happen. I warned people at the ABC that this would be met with a bitter backlash, because to dare to even speak the truth in our country when it's First Nations truth risks hatred and racism. We know that. I didn't want to do it. My cousin Teela Reid, a Wiradjuri Walwan lawyer, was going to be on, and she asked me if I would do it with her. And we knew, as we always know, that whenever we come to talk about our history, these sensitive, fragile things, the things that hurt us so much, that we have to do so gently. We have to take Australia by the hand. We need to have these conversations with love and respect. And I know that, and I think it's important that we do that, because I was taught by my people to be a man of love and respect, to have love even for those people who have no love for us. As the first people of this land, it is important that we model a better way of being, a way of doing things, of reaching out to people with love and honour and respect. That was the language we used that night, but we spoke about hard truths. I spoke of the Crown stealing our land, locking us up on missions and reserves, taking away our children. I spoke of the personal pain of my family. My mother's father, my grandfather, chained to a tree like a dog by police, wearing the symbol of that crown because he was accused of drinking alcohol. My grandfather, my father's father, fighting a war for this country, coming back to Australia that would not allow him to drink in the pub with the mates that he'd served with, and police enforcing that in the name of the Crown. Of frontier wars that were fought against us in the name of the Crown. These are not opinions, these things are true. Yet before I had uttered a single word, the viciousness and the racism had begun. The ABC had one of its staff members monitoring the comments on Twitter. She went home that night feeling sick because of what she'd seen and read. And it had begun before I had said a single word. And in the days and weeks that have followed, no one has reported the words that were really spoken. How we said, we say these truths with love, with respect. How we speak of truth, not grievance. How we fight for an Australia that we still want to believe in, a better Australia that can truly celebrate all of us and to treat the lives of First Nations people with the dignity, love, respect, and preciousness that we should be treated with, because our culture is such a gift to this country. None of that was reported. Instead, I was depicted as a hateful, spiteful person. One person said that that hour of television was the most hateful hour of television she had ever seen. The headlines, day after day after day, more than 100 articles in 10 days, and every one of them featuring my face, and every single one of them accusing the ABC of hatred and bias. And every time those articles appeared, or every time someone spoke on television, my family were viciously attacked and insulted. Me, my wife, my children, my mother and father, who've done nothing but try to give back love to a country that has treated them so brutally. So you may wonder, how can I survive in an industry that in 40 years has not moved that far from telling racist jokes and laughing at me and saying I'm almost a white man, to putting me on television and telling lies about what I say and whipping up hatred against me and my family? And what hope is there for us to have the conversations that we need to have this year, in the year of a referendum on the voice, when we can't even begin to have those conversations without people being subjected to the worst types of racial abuse and violence? And we continue to see our people die in our country far too often. What hope is there when the media continues to fail? In walking away on Q&A, I said, I don't believe that the media has the language or the love to be able to speak to the gentle spirits of this land. The language or the love, we certainly don't have the language. The language we use in the media is a language of conflict, of division, of pitting people against each other. It's a language of winners and losers. It's not a language that brings us together. It's a language that keeps us apart. And love, there is no place for love in the media. Far too often there is just a place for hate and evil. And as Toni Morrison, the great African-American writer, once said, hate and evil are always attractive. Hate and evil wears a top hat and a cane, she said. Hate and evil has the best role on the stage, while goodness and kindness and love languishes in the shadows. Hate shouts and love whispers. So, of course, hate is heard in the media. But in the weeks since the King's coronation, and in spite of the hatred that's been rained down on me and my family, that is keeping me from being with you today, I've seen the whisper of love in our country. I was at the Writers' Festival in Sydney on the weekend and I heard the whisper of love. I get stopped in the street by people who tell me how sorry they are and ashamed they are for what's happening in this country, and I hear the whisper of love. I hear the whisper of love from my own people who always know what to say. Cousins of mine who've called me up and said, come home, brother. Come home. Let's go out on country. Let's go and sit down by the river. And I'm going to go home. I'm going to take the time to go home and try to wash the stench of 40 years of the media off my skin, to go home and breathe the air of love and block my ears to the hate that we hear far too often in the media, and wonder if I can ever come back to it. And I hope when I'm out there in my country that I hear the whisper of love that says yes, yes. It's so easy to say no. And when it comes to the referendum, there may be good reasons why people think that they can say no. And I know amongst my own people, there is different opinions. But I would just say, in a year when we have seen how brutal racism can still be, when we have seen how the media does not care for the language of love, that we'll be able to whisper yes. Because if we say no, there is nothing left. There's nothing after no. Someone says to you, I love you, and you say no back, there is nothing after that. But yes gives us a tomorrow. Yes leads us to the next question, and the next and the next. Yes to a voice. Yes to a treaty. Yes to truth. Yes to a better Australia. Yes gives us possibility, and no just sounds like the end. Yes sounds like the love I've heard in the last 2 weeks, and no sounds like the racists of social media who continue to hound my family. We have a responsibility in the media to treat ourselves better. We have a responsibility to reach for something greater. Never before have we been able to speak to so many people in so many ways, in so many parts of the world so quickly, and yet our world is torn apart by hate. We owe it to ourselves to be better. We owe it to ourselves to turn off the television and the radio and put down the newspapers if they are not serving us well. We owe it to ourselves not to watch programs that turn love into an amusement park, programs where they pretend people can meet each other as strangers and get married tomorrow and call that love. We've got to stop debasing ourselves, and we've got to reach for something more. And my people who have survived 200 years of the worst of this country are the people who can still teach this country to love, and in the face of everything, offer hope to a country in the face of hopelessness. I'm going to take time out to go back home to that place, to sit in the arms of my people by those rivers, under those stars, hear the birds and hear the wind through the trees, and fill myself up on love and ask myself if I can ever come back to a media of hate. I wish I could be with you in my language. Can I just say, Mandangur, that means thank you, and Yindyamara, that means respect. Respect to all of you in the room, and thank you for having me, and hopefully we can meet again under better circumstances, and I may be able to be among you. Thank you so much.